What if I told you that some tunnels don't just connect two places, but two different times, two different realities, two completely different versions of the world you thought you knew? What if the simple act of driving through what appears to be ordinary infrastructure could transport you not just miles away, but years away, decades away, or into a version of existence where everything you understand about time and space becomes meaningless? Michael Torres learned this the hard way on what should have been the most routine drive of his life. A software engineer commuting from his office in downtown Portland to his suburban home, Michael had driven through the Sunset Tunnel hundreds of times over the past 3 years. The tunnel was unremarkable, practical, efficient, a standard piece of urban infrastructure that cut his commute by 15 minutes, and allowed him to avoid the worst of the evening traffic that plagued the city's surface streets. On that Tuesday afternoon in March, Michael entered the tunnel at exactly 2:47 p.m. He knew the time precisely because he'd just finished a conference call that had run long, and he was checking his phone to see if he'd have time to stop at the grocery store before it closed. The tunnel entrance looked exactly as it always did. Concrete walls painted a utilitarian beige, fluorescent lighting that cast everything in a harsh, clinical glow, and the familiar yellow signs warning drivers to maintain safe distances and speeds. The drive through the tunnel typically took 3 minutes. Michael had timed it once during a particularly boring commute, counting off the seconds as he passed the familiar landmarks. The emergency phone at the halfway point, the slight curve near the 3/4 mark, the faint light that grew brighter as you approached the exit. It was a journey so routine that Michael barely registered it anymore, letting his mind wander to dinner plans or weekend projects while his car moved through the underground passage. But something was different this time. As Michael drove deeper into the tunnel, the familiar fluorescent lights seemed to dim, creating pockets of shadow that hadn't been there before. The emergency phone that should have appeared at the halfway point was nowhere to be seen. The tunnel felt longer than usual, stretching ahead of him in a way that defied his memory of its actual dimensions. Most unsettling of all, Michael realized he couldn't see any other cars, either ahead of him or behind him, despite entering the tunnel during what should have been the middle of rush hour. When Michael finally emerged from the tunnel, the first thing he noticed was the darkness. The bright afternoon sun that had been shining when he entered was gone, replaced by the deep black of night. Streetlights illuminated unfamiliar intersections, and the digital clock on his dashboard showed 11:23 p.m. Michael's rational mind immediately sought explanations. Maybe his clock was wrong. Maybe there had been an accident that had delayed traffic for hours. Maybe he'd somehow lost consciousness during the drive. But as Michael looked around, trying to orient himself, he realized that nothing looked familiar. The buildings were wrong. The street signs showed names he didn't recognize, and even the style of the streetlights was different from what he remembered seeing in Portland. His GPS was spinning uselessly, unable to find a satellite signal, and his phone showed no service bars despite being in what should have been the middle of a major metropolitan area. Michael pulled over at what appeared to be a gas station, though even this was strange. The pumps looked like they belonged in a different decade, with mechanical displays instead of digital readouts, and prices that seemed impossibly low. When he tried to go inside to ask for directions, he found the door locked and a handwritten sign that said "Closed for emergency." Through the window he could see a calendar on the wall, but the month and year displayed made no sense given what he knew about the current date. The streets themselves felt wrong in ways that Michael couldn't quite articulate. The pavement had a different texture, the paint on the lane markers was a slightly different shade of white, and even the smell in the air was unfamiliar. It was as if he'd driven into a version of reality that was almost correct, but subtly, disturbingly off in countless tiny details. Michael drove for over an hour through this strange nocturnal landscape, desperately trying to find something familiar, some landmark that would help him understand where he was and how he'd gotten there. Every intersection led to more unfamiliar streets. Every building was subtly wrong in ways he couldn't define, and every person he saw moved with a dreamlike quality that made him question whether they were really there at all. The gas gauge in his car, which had been 3/4 full when he entered the tunnel, was now showing nearly empty despite his having driven what felt like only a few miles. When Michael stopped at another gas station, this one apparently open, the attendant looked at him with confusion when Michael tried to explain his situation. The man's accent was familiar but slightly off. as if he were speaking a dialect of English that Michael had never heard before. Most disturbing was what happened when Michael tried to use his credit card. The machine rejected it repeatedly, displaying error messages that suggested the card number didn't exist in their system. When Michael showed his driver's license, the attendant examined it closely and then looked at Michael with suspicion, pointing out that the license format didn't match any state he knew of and that the security features were all wrong. Michael's phone, meanwhile, remained completely dead despite showing a full charge. No calls would go through, no data connection was available, and even the emergency 911 number resulted in a recording saying that the number was not in service. It was as if the entire telecommunications infrastructure he relied on had simply ceased to exist. As the night wore on, Michael began to encounter other people who seemed to be in similar states of confusion. Sarah Chen, a nurse from what she insisted was Seattle, had driven through a tunnel during her morning commute and emerged into the same impossible night. Her story was nearly identical to Michael's, a routine trip through familiar infrastructure that had somehow transported her not just to a different place, but to what seemed like an entirely different version of reality. David Martinez had experienced something even more disorienting. He'd entered a tunnel in broad daylight in Los Angeles and emerged into what appeared to be the same city, but one where the skyline was completely different. Buildings he'd known his entire life were missing, replaced by structures he'd never seen before. The streets followed the same basic pattern, but the businesses were different. The architectural styles were wrong, and even the mountains in the distance seemed to have different shapes. Most unsettling was David's discovery that in this version of Los Angeles, his apartment building didn't exist. The address led to an empty lot with no evidence that anything had ever been built there. His bank had no record of his accounts, his employer had never heard of him, and his family seemed to have vanished entirely. It was as if he'd slipped into a parallel universe where his entire life had never happened. The three of them found each other by accident, drawn together by their shared confusion and the strange looks they were getting from the locals. None of them could explain what had happened, but they all agreed that the tunnels they'd driven through had somehow transported them not just to different locations, but to different versions of reality entirely. As they compared their experiences, disturbing patterns emerged. All of them had entered their respective tunnels during routine commutes, at times when they were thinking about mundane concerns rather than paying close attention to their surroundings. All of them had noticed that the tunnels seemed longer and darker than usual during their passage, and all of them had emerged into a world that was familiar enough to be recognizable, but different enough to be deeply unsettling. Most importantly, none of them could find their way back to the tunnels they'd originally entered. The infrastructure that had brought them to this strange place seemed to have vanished entirely, leaving them stranded in a reality that resembled their own, but was fundamentally alien in countless subtle ways. Michael tried desperately to find logical explanations for what was happening. Maybe there had been some kind of gas leak in the tunnel that had caused hallucinations. Maybe he'd suffered a stroke or head injury that had affected his perception. Maybe he was dreaming or having some kind of psychological breakdown that was causing him to interpret familiar surroundings as foreign and threatening. But every rational explanation crumbled under the weight of the evidence. His physical symptoms were normal, his thinking was clear, and the other people he'd met were experiencing identical phenomena. Whatever had happened wasn't a personal medical emergency or psychological crisis. It was something far stranger and more disturbing, a fundamental breach in the nature of reality itself. The implications were staggering. If simple tunnels could serve as doorways between different versions of reality, then the world was far more complex and dangerous than anyone had imagined. Every routine commute, every mundane journey through familiar infrastructure, carried the potential for transportation, not just to a different place, but to an entirely different existence. For Michael, Sarah, and David, the question was no longer how they'd gotten to this strange place, but whether they would ever be able to find their way home. And as they spent more time in this almost familiar world, they began to wonder whether the reality they remembered was actually real, or whether they'd always been living in this strange place and had somehow developed false memories of a different life entirely. The tunnels had taken them somewhere impossible, somewhere that shouldn't exist, somewhere that challenged everything they thought they knew about the nature of space, time, and reality itself. And the most terrifying realization was that if they could slip from their reality into this one so easily, then perhaps reality itself was far more fragile than anyone had ever dared to imagine. What other doorways existed in the mundane infrastructure of daily life? What other passages might transport unsuspecting travelers to impossible destinations? And how many people had already made these journeys without anyone ever knowing they were gone? The tunnels had revealed a secret about the nature of existence that was both fascinating and terrifying. The world we think we live in might be only one layer of a much more complex and dangerous reality, where the simple act of driving through a tunnel could change everything you thought you knew about your own life. The Michael Torres case shattered something fundamental about how we understand the world around us. Within days of his story, spreading through online forums and social media groups, reports began flooding in from across the globe. Drivers who'd experienced impossible journeys, commuters who'd lost hours or days during routine trips, families who'd entered tunnels together only to emerge in completely different realities. What had seemed like an isolated incident was revealing itself to be part of a phenomenon so widespread that it challenged the very foundation of reality itself. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: infrastructure engineers who'd been quietly documenting anomalies for years without understanding what they were recording. Janet Walsh, a civil engineer with the Department of Transportation, had been investigating reports of timing discrepancies in tunnel traffic for over a decade. Cars entering tunnels but not appearing on exit sensors for hours, sometimes days. Vehicle counts that never matched between entrance and exit points. GPS systems that showed cars disappearing from tracking networks while inside tunnels, only to reappear hundreds of miles away. Initially, Janet attributed these anomalies to equipment failures or data processing errors, but as the reports accumulated, patterns emerged that couldn't be explained by technical malfunctions. Specific tunnels consistently showed these timing discrepancies. The missing time was always significant, never just a few minutes that might be attributed to system lag, but hours or days that suggested something far more fundamental was occurring. The Harrison Tunnel in Nevada had the highest concentration of reported anomalies. Built in 1987 as part of a highway improvement project, the tunnel was structurally sound, well-maintained, and showed no signs of the problems that plagued other aging infrastructure. But the data told a different story entirely. Between 2020 and 2024, over 300 vehicles had entered the Harrison Tunnel and failed to appear on exit sensors within the expected time frame. Some appeared hours later, some appeared days later, and 17 had never appeared at all. Maria Rodriguez experienced the Harrison Tunnel's temporal distortion firsthand during what should have been a simple weekend trip to visit her sister. She entered the tunnel at 10:15 a.m. on a Saturday morning, driving through bright desert sunshine with clear skies and perfect visibility. The tunnel was approximately 2 miles long, a straight shot through a mountain that typically took 3 minutes to traverse at highway speeds. Maria emerged from the tunnel into complete darkness, her car's clock showing 3:47 a.m. Tuesday morning. She'd been driving for over 65 hours, but had no memory of the time that had passed. Her fuel gauge, which had been nearly full when she entered, showed completely empty. Her phone displayed dozens of missed calls from her sister, her employer, and the police department that had been contacted when she failed to arrive at her destination. Most disturbing was Maria's discovery that she wasn't where she was supposed to be. The Harrison Tunnel should have deposited her on Highway 50 in central Nevada, but she'd emerged onto a road that didn't appear on any map she could find. The landscape was similar to what she remembered from Nevada, but subtly wrong in ways she couldn't articulate. The mountains had different shapes, the vegetation was different, and even the quality of the light seemed strange and unfamiliar. When Maria tried to contact emergency services, she discovered that her phone couldn't connect to any network. Radio stations picked up broadcasts in languages she didn't recognize, and the few signs she encountered showed place names that didn't correspond to any real locations. It took her 14 hours of driving to find a town that appeared on conventional maps, and even then, the people she spoke with seemed confused by her story and unable to provide useful directions. The Chen family's experience with the Harbor Tunnel in Baltimore revealed even more disturbing aspects of these temporal disruptions. David Chen, his wife Linda, and their 10-year-old daughter Amy had entered the tunnel together during a family trip to visit Linda's parents. They entered at 2:30 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, all three of them in the same car, following the same route they'd taken dozens of times before, but they didn't emerge together. David found himself alone in the car when he exited the tunnel, driving through a version of Baltimore where the inner harbor looked completely different, and buildings he'd known his entire life had been replaced by structures he'd never seen before. Linda emerged from the tunnel 6 hours later in a different part of the city, convinced that she'd been driving alone the entire time and unable to remember anything about David or Amy. Amy was found 3 days later by police in Philadelphia, over 100 miles away, sitting calmly in a park and insisting that her parents had dropped her off there after lunch. She had detailed memories of the drive from Baltimore to Philadelphia, including stops at restaurants that didn't exist and conversations with her parents about plans they'd never made. When reunited with David and Linda, Amy became increasingly agitated, insisting that these weren't her real parents and that her actual family was still waiting for her in Philadelphia. DNA tests confirmed that Amy was indeed David and Linda's daughter, but the psychological impact on the family was devastating. Amy maintained her insistence that she belonged with a different family, while David and Linda struggled with fragmented memories that didn't align with their previous understanding of their life together. The tunnel had somehow separated them not just physically, but experientially, depositing them in versions of reality where their family history was fundamentally different. Dr. Amanda Foster's research into these cases revealed patterns that suggested the tunnels weren't randomly transporting people, but were somehow selective about who experienced these temporal disruptions. Statistical analysis showed that certain personality types, stress levels, and even specific times of day correlated with higher probability of experiencing tunnel anomalies. People who were driving alone, who were in transitional periods in their lives, or who were dealing with significant personal stress, were significantly more likely to emerge from tunnels in the wrong time or place. The most disturbing cases involved people who returned from tunnel journeys with evidence of lives they'd never lived. Robert Kim entered the Queens Midtown Tunnel in New York and emerged with a wallet full of credit cards and identification documents showing a different address, a different employer, and even a different wife. The documents were genuine. They passed every security check and appeared in all relevant databases. But Robert had no memory of the life they described. Even more unsettling, when Robert tried to return to his original life, he discovered that his apartment was occupied by a different Robert Kim, who claimed to have been living there for 15 years. This other Robert had the same face, the same fingerprints, and even the same childhood memories. But his adult life had followed a completely different trajectory. It was as if the tunnel had transported Robert not just to a different place, but to a different version of his own existence. Sarah Martinez's experience with the Fort Pitt Tunnel in Pittsburgh revealed the most disturbing aspect of these dimensional shifts. Some people preferred their new realities and actively resisted returning to their original lives. Sarah had entered the tunnel during a particularly difficult period, dealing with a recent divorce, financial problems, and health issues that had left her feeling hopeless and trapped. She emerged from the tunnel into a version of her life where none of these problems existed. In this reality, her marriage had worked out, her career had flourished, and her health problems had never developed. The house she returned to was larger and more beautiful than the one she remembered. Her bank accounts showed balances she'd never achieved, and even her relationships with family members were warmer and more supportive. When investigators tried to help Sarah return to her original reality, she refused. She'd found a version of her life that was simply better in every measurable way, and she couldn't understand why anyone would expect her to give it up. The ethical implications were staggering. If people could access better versions of their lives through dimensional travel, did anyone have the right to prevent them from staying in those improved realities? The tunnels themselves began to show signs of awareness of the attention they were receiving. The Harrison Tunnel, which had been the subject of intensive investigation, suddenly stopped producing temporal anomalies entirely. Traffic flowed through it normally for 6 months, with every car emerging exactly when and where it was supposed to. Then, without warning, the anomalies resumed, but now they followed different patterns that seemed designed to avoid the monitoring equipment that had been installed. Other tunnels showed similar behavioral changes. The Fort Pitt Tunnel began producing anomalies only during specific weather conditions, as if it had learned to mask its activity. The Queens Midtown Tunnel started affecting only vehicles with certain license plate patterns, creating correlations that seemed too systematic to be random. It was as if the tunnels were actively adapting to avoid detection, suggesting an intelligence behind the phenomena that was far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. The most chilling discovery came from archived traffic data going back decades. When researchers analyzed historical records with new understanding of what to look for, they found evidence that tunnel anomalies had been occurring for as long as tunnels had existed. The missing persons databases were filled with cases of people who disappeared while traveling through tunnels, only to be found days or weeks later in impossible locations with no memory of how they'd gotten there. The implications were staggering. Thousands of people might have been transported to alternative realities over the decades, living lives in parallel dimensions while their families mourned their disappearances. Missing persons who'd never been found might be living happily in better versions of their lives, while the people searching for them existed in realities where those better lives had never been possible. Government agencies began quietly investigating specific tunnels, installing monitoring equipment and interviewing travelers who reported unusual experiences. But their efforts were hampered by the selective nature of the phenomena. The tunnels seemed to recognize when they were being watched and would often cease producing anomalies entirely during periods of intensive observation. The psychological impact on families and communities was profound. People began avoiding certain tunnels entirely, taking longer routes that added hours to their commutes rather than risk being transported to unknown realities. Others actively sought out tunnels with reported anomalies, hoping to find better versions of their lives in parallel dimensions. Insurance companies struggled with claims from people who'd lost time, property, or even family members to tunnel anomalies. How do you process a claim for a missing person who's been found living a completely different life in a parallel reality? How do you verify identity when someone returns from a tunnel with documentation of a life they've never lived? The most disturbing aspect of the tunnel phenomena was its complete unpredictability. There was no way to determine which tunnels would produce anomalies, when they would occur, or what kind of reality displacement would result. People could drive through the same tunnel hundreds of times with no unusual experiences, only to be transported to a completely different dimension on what seemed like a perfectly ordinary trip. For every person who found a better life through tunnel travel, there were others who emerged into realities where their worst fears had been realized. Some found themselves in worlds where their loved ones had died, where their careers had failed, or where their personal relationships had deteriorated beyond repair. The tunnels offered no guarantees, no way to predict or control the destination. The evidence accumulated from hundreds of cases painted a picture of reality that was far more complex and fragile than anyone had imagined. The mundane infrastructure of daily life, the tunnels we drove through without a second thought, had revealed themselves to be doorways between infinite versions of existence. Every routine commute carried the potential for transportation not just to a different place but to an entirely different life. The question was no longer whether these parallel realities existed, but how many versions of every moment, every choice, every possibility were playing out simultaneously across infinite dimensions. And the most unsettling realization was that the tunnels might not be creating these alternative realities, but simply providing access to versions of existence that had always been there, separated from our awareness by barriers so thin that they could be crossed with nothing more than a routine drive through familiar infrastructure. For everyone who heard these stories, every tunnel became a question mark. Every routine journey became a potential leap into the unknown. The simple act of driving from one place to another had been revealed as one of the most dangerous activities imaginable. A journey that might transport you not just to your intended destination, but to a completely different version of your own existence. The tunnels had taught us that reality itself might be nothing more than a thin layer over an infinite sea of possibilities, and that sometimes the barriers between what is and what might be are no thicker than the walls of a highway tunnel. The most terrifying part wasn't that these journeys were possible, but that they were happening all the time, to ordinary people living ordinary lives, who simply wanted to get from one place to another, and instead found themselves transported to worlds where everything they thought they knew about their own existence was completely and permanently different.